think infrastructure is something that everyone can agree we want more of, and then the question comes, how do you pay for it? And there's less unity of purpose in terms of deciding how to pay for it. I think we've seen, look, the history of the United States was massive investment in infrastructure that led to the kind of dynamic economy in many periods, but most recently from the 50s, through the 20th century. We've been drawing down some of our reserves, aging highways, aging ports, aging airports. We're not the only country, the only developed country to do that. I think we've seen a resurgence of investment in many areas. I live in New York City. When I can fly again, I'm delighted that I'm going to be going to an airport, which has been rebuilt, during the COVID crisis. That was a project that was initiated through a public-private partnership, some federal funding. We got to find more ways to do that. I think that President Biden is a huge believer in infrastructure. He managed a very large infrastructure program as part of the Recovery Act in 2009-10. And I think he's going to look for the largest infrastructure investment he can get a broad consensus behind. If we do part of it as a recovery package and don't have to pay for it because it's stimulus, that will be easy but smaller. The challenge will be to build a consensus to say, we need this not just for 2 to 3 years, we need this for 5 to 10 years. And we need to pull everyone together and say, here's how we're going to pay for it. That's going to be harder. It's not so much the short-termism as it is the kind of political difficulty of in a world where from the 1990s until the COVID crisis, mostly things like this had to be paid for, with the exception of things like the Recovery Act during the Great Recession. That's where the stumbling block has been. It's not that if you don't want to raise the gasoline tax and you don't want to have an energy tax and you don't want to cut social spending and you have to pay for it, the amount of infrastructure you can afford tends to be reduced. I think there's a growing understanding of the need for the investment. I think there's a growing impatience with the inadequacy when people get stuck in traffic because the roads are inadequate, or the experience at an airport feels more like a nightmare than a good dream. And I think the public is open to dealing with this. I think leaders have to be willing to do some hard things. And maybe that's a long-term ish question, because the benefits come at the end of the road. You pay the price for paying for it at the beginning of the journey. And that's where the kind of rubber hits the road. Critical part of the Recovery Act, it was hundreds of billions of dollars, which at the time seemed like a lot of money. And it was the largest stimulus package since Franklin Roosevelt in the Great Depression. It's only because of the massive, scale of the COVID crisis and response that those numbers no longer seem large. There was a highway investment program. Candidly, we came close to funding a much bigger infrastructure initiative using the opportunity to reform our tax system to combine infrastructure with a rewrite of our tax code. In the end, that didn't come about, in my view, because Republican legislators didn't really want to have that kind of a historic accomplishment on President Obama's scorecard. And sadly, when there was a Republican president and a Republican Congress, they rewrote the tax code and they used all of the space they had to cut corporate and individual tax rates, and they didn't invest anything in infrastructure. Had they invested something in infrastructure, they probably could have had a bipartisan bill.